Station gives you great talk every day.
Once you have money, to have influence and power, you can rule in Nigeria. The Supreme Court said that one old man came to testify because the old man cannot lie. That they gave him judgment.
This man will embezzle the money. This is a military man. Why can't you prove your NMPC the way it will be DPS?
Better to say, I will come and do my best, Nigeria. Please support me. Let's how we work together.
Yeah, stop defending him.
I am not. I'm
defending him a lot.
If your ministers don't work, vote them out of office. If the governors don't work, vote them out of office. Well, I'm hoping that you can educate yourself enough.
I think a black man is caught.
No, don't say that.
We are suffering from post-traumatic disorder. We're traumatized.
How do you say that the world is survival of the fittest?
Hear the news, air your views, and we'll tell you what's new.
your number one station for talk.
99.3 Nigeria Info. Let's talk.
Welcome back to Borderlines, the only show that takes you beyond borders. Last week, we had Professor Scott Lucas, who is the professor of international politics at the Clinton Institute, University College Dublin, Professor Emeritus of the International Politics at the University of Birmingham, and Editor-in-Chief of EA Worldview. He's a specialist in American politics, US and British foreign policy, and international affairs, including the Middle East and Iran, Europe and Asia. So last week when I left, when I on my way home or when I got home, I had so many messages. Oh my God, what a brilliant conversation you had with Professor Lucas. Who was that professor you had with you? Yada, 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 and all of that stuff. And I said to them, when Professor Lucas comes on, well, I guess you would say that I'm like this with everybody, but really, when some people come on, the conversation 1 hour is just not enough. We needed to pick his brain more, like literally more. We are talking about the biggest shift to happen, since World War II in this global space that we all exist in. We're talking about the changing hegemonic structure. Yes, hegemony, that's power. Those who lord it over the rest of the world and tell you must do this, you must do that, etc., etc. Professor Lucas, Scott Lucas, a friend of the house, welcome. How are you?
Oh, thank you so much for letting me come in and join you again. It's made my Friday.
It's an absolute pleasure. As always, we have so many to cover, but I've got to ask you though before we go on. So yesterday, Keir Starmer had the joint press conference with Trump, with President Trump. A couple of days before, 2 days before, we had Macron, okay? And today, we don't even know what's happening. I don't know whether Zelensky, because I've been at work, Zelensky has arrived yet, and what's going on. What do you make of all this stuff? Because Europe is going to visit Trump to try and talk him into doing things a certain way. I mean, Trump is feeling like the king. He's even got a special invitation from Prince Charles. Keir Starmer is literally like up his carsy. You know what that means.
I knew you all would have fun in Nigeria with that. I knew that when you saw him handing that envelope from King Charles,
I couldn't speak.
Shall I read it? Shall I read it?
Yeah.
And then Trump looks at it and goes, "Ooh, it's signed. What a beautiful signature.
What a beautiful. It's beautiful."
Yeah. I'm going to tell you a story in a minute. In fact, I'm going to join all the dots here with what happened.
Join the dots.
Story, right?
Join the dots.
And I've got to do the serious stuff first and then the fun stuff.
Okay.
With it, right? The serious stuff is that the Macron visit on Monday, Emmanuel Macron in the White House, Keir Starmer yesterday, Vladimir Zelensky, is all connected. And the connection is that there is a plan which has been worked on for about 18 months, which is that troops from Britain, France, and some other NATO members could go into Ukraine, not to fight. They would go into Western Ukraine, far away from the battlefield, but they're there to work with the air defenses. They're there to protect the energy infrastructure, and they're there to protect facilities like drone manufacturing plants, which are very, very important in this conflict. So they're there to help keep Ukraine going. Now, what Britain and France need, indeed what the Europeans need for this is, they need American air power so the Russians don't try to attack these forces. America has got warplanes in Poland. They've got them in Romania, right? And so what Macron does on Monday, not in public, he says it away from this, and he has advisors who are talking to American officials, is, can we get this plan, right? Starmer goes on Thursday, and away from the cameras, his officials are talking to the American officials going, what do you think of the plan? Can we make this work? Zelensky, who's going to sign this deal by which Ukraine gets money for some of its minerals, and they in the U.S. manage this fund, right, for reconstruction. Zelensky will sign that agreement, but away from the ceremony, he'll be talking to American officials of, all right, are you going to give us the security guarantees? This is what we want. Now, all of this is connected. Your problem here, your issue here is that Donald Trump doesn't think in terms of cooperation and multilateral groups. He doesn't think of a win-win situation. He is the transactional president, the transactional businessman who is, what can I get out of this, right? So let me tell you a story which is key to this. From day one of the Trump administration in the first term, some countries had this figured out. They had intelligence on Trump. So Saudi Arabia invites Trump over, and they put some gold around his neck. And he goes, oh, I like this gold. And for the rest of his first term, he does whatever Saudi Arabia really wants. When Saudi Arabia killed, the leader of Saudi Arabia ordered the killing of Jamal Khashoggi in 2018, which caused an international scandal. Trump supported Saudi over it, right?
Yes.
The UAE, another Gulf state, very rich, they give Trump some lovely stuff, and he likes the UAE. They contributed to his campaign as well. That helps. When China wants to make sure Trump isn't too mean against them, they invite him over to Beijing, right? But here's my favorite. In 2019, when North Korea thinks we can play him, we can get him to not pick on us, not threaten us, they send over a guy, the vice president of North Korea, with a giant envelope. And he hands the giant envelope to Trump. It looks like one of those, like if you win the lottery, you get that big check. And Trump holds up this big envelope, and he's like beaming from ear to ear. Look, I have a giant envelope inviting me to go to North Korea. So when Keir Starmer went in
yesterday,
this is unprecedented. This is special. This is wonderful. And hands him that envelope. They know exactly how Trump's going to react. They know he's going to do this.
Of course.
Right? And what they've done is, in terms of the PR, the publicity, they've bought themselves good pictures.
Absolutely.
And what the UK gets out of it, first of all, Starmer gets some of the domestic pressure off of him, because we've got two networks, national networks in the UK that are effectively networks for Trump and networks for the Reform Party, right, of Nigel Farage. And so Starmer basically pushes them back, but also Starmer gets acceptance of this very unusual case where the UK is trying to transfer the Chagos Islands back to Mauritius.
Yes, of course, yeah.
And the right wing in the UK is all like, oh, you can't do that, can't give up our territory, blah, 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 right? And he got Trump to say, no, it's okay. The U.S. will agree to this. And here's the big thing that Starmer probably got yesterday. He got the UK off of the tariff stage, because Trump threatens tariffs against everybody. And just a couple of days ago, he said, I'm going to put 25% tariffs on the EU, European Union, because the European Union was created to screw America, which is not true, but, that's the way Trump works. Okay. The UK is, we're not part of the EU, Brexit, we're not part of the EU. Don't put tariffs on us. And they've got themselves some space because of what happened. So all of that is in play.
I've got to take you back to what you said, and this is really curious for me. For somebody, did you say this plan you have to repeat it, 18 months? What do you mean? What was the plan?
In 18 months, look, I've got some very, very good people who I work with, and I talked about this a couple of weeks ago, and one of those very, very good people, I won't give the name at this point, but someone who is very well connected said, look, you've got to realize, because this is when I first heard of this plan to put the British and the French troops in Western Ukraine. I said, look, and she said, you've got to realize this plan has been discussed in NATO since the middle of 2023, right? And that is that.
But did NATO
Russia,
say that out openly? I mean, gosh, I pride myself on following these things.
It did get said open. It got said openly. It got floated at the start of last year, if you go back, by Emmanuel Macron.
Right.
Emmanuel Macron effectively sent up a trial balloon, as we would call it, right? And said, why don't we put troops inside? Now, at that point, a number of European leaders said, no, you can't do that. No, that's premature. One of them was Olaf Scholz, who was the German chancellor.
Yes.
Right?
The one that just lost his
Olaf,
position, yes.
Olaf Scholz is no longer German chancellor.
Yes.
And the guy who is replacing him, Friedrich Merz, is a lot more forthright in terms of support for Ukraine.
Right.
So here we go. We move a year later. Russia is still trying to knock out Ukraine's energy infrastructure. But the risk is now that the Trump administration is going to side with the Russians. So this almost is Europe, they have to step up now. And part of stepping up is to actually say, we think we're going to try to pursue this plan.
But here's the thing with that plan, though. Nobody was talking to Putin. So, as you said, Europe has been planning to put boots on the ground as peacekeepers to protect Ukraine, right? But Europe was not talking about ending the war. So, what peace were they going to be keeping?
Well, these weren't peacekeepers. This is what you've got to understand here.
Right.
Now, they're not peacekeepers. They're not aggressors, though. This is not part of that Russian conspiracy theory. They're all there to attack us. We are at the point where Vladimir Putin, he can make gradual advances on the ground in eastern Ukraine. But that on its own does not get him his goal of taking over Ukraine and dominating it. What Russia does as well is they want to try to break Ukraine's energy infrastructure. That's what they try to do on a daily basis with the missiles and drones, right? And at times they've created a lot of damage. So one thing is that you want to protect that energy infrastructure, right? Because here's the second thing. If you use British and French troops to protect the energy infrastructure, it frees up Ukrainians to do other tasks, right? They might go to the front line to fight. They might go to other areas that need to be protected of public services, right? But you help Ukraine protect its energy. You also protect Ukraine's advantage, its growing advantage in drones. Ukraine's drones have been increasingly effective at hitting Russian territory, Russian oil installations, Russian military bases, Russian supply hubs. They're causing a great deal of damage because they've really been developing the technology for the drones. But you have to be able to have places where you can make the drones. You know the Russians are going to try to target them. So what you do is you put the personnel there. Because what you're doing is you're saying to Vladimir Putin, do you really want to attack somewhere where there are European forces who are not combatants? They're not fighting. They're there protecting the facilities.
So
right?
Here's the thing, though. Russia has said, I think it was the day after Macron, because Macron had suggested that. Trump had said, yes, I think he's going to go for that. Immediately, the Russians came out and said, no, we're not. Right? So even before we move on to the bigger picture, what is it then? So the security, we have two sort of points on this peace treaty that Trump is trying to get together. You've got the minerals deal with Ukraine that America wants. EU has jumped on the same deal, saying they want theirs. Then you've got the security guarantees, which is still up in the air. And of course, you've got Putin, who's got to say yes to any security, any boots on the ground, wherever. Europe, Keir Starmer yesterday said the same thing again, and he's asking America to support them, not necessarily with boots on the ground, but with air defense protection. That is not, Trump hasn't committed to that. What he said is, we'll have people mining there, so you'll be okay. Talk to us, unpack that.
Let's play let's play connect the dots. The
Yes,
first thing, which
connect
is
the
easier
dots.
to talk
That's
about,
the word. Yeah.
is that the minerals deal, which the Ukraine had proposed last autumn, right? The reason why it took so long is that they don't want to give away the minerals, which is what Trump was demanding. They want to get funds in exchange for the minerals, which they've gotten the Americans to agree to, right? There'll be a joint fund for Ukraine's reconstruction. But for Ukraine, this was only part of getting a wider deal. So you get the minerals deal, you get the Americans involved, they have an interest there. And then you say, well, if you want to get the minerals, you got to make sure that Russia doesn't take the territory where the minerals come from, right? So you need to give us the security guarantees to be able to hold on to our territory. So for Zelensky, this was only, and Zelensky's open about this. The minerals deal was only a first step to getting a wider agreement. And he would have arranged that. He would have discussed that with the European leaders, right? Now, but you make the key point here. The thing is if they can, if there is a ceasefire deal, they'll have to do this anyway, right? The question here is whether you put these people in before you get a ceasefire. That's the big question. And the thinking here is if you put them in before you get a ceasefire, it puts pressure on Putin, right? Because it puts the stakes to him. You can't just keep firing missiles and drones on these positions, right? Because you might kill someone, British or French peacekeeper. Do you really want to do that? Alternatively, Putin says, I can't do it. I have to back off of firing on this. I can't really risk this. And he's got to roll back his war aims, right? So you do that. But you've identified the key question. You've got to get the Americans to provide air power, to provide the protection. Now, if you look just at Donald Trump, who repeated yesterday, well, here's what he said. I love Trump because you have to take the absurdity of Trump to get to the way the man thinks. He genuinely does not understand. He does not comprehend. So he said yesterday, yes, we're going to give Ukraine a security guarantee, but it's going to be the U.S. workers who are getting the minerals. It was like he's thinking that like there are guys who are going to go out like in hard hats with little pickaxes, whatever, to dig these minerals like lithium and titanium out of the ground. And they're like a human shield that the Russians won't attack.
But isn't he also saying, or couldn't he also be saying that, look, as long as Americans are working and mining over there, Vladimir Putin would not dare kill an American. I know that because that's not something he would do. But the question then becomes, how do you protect those workers if you don't use the military?
My point here is that's not the way you get the minerals out of the ground, right? The way that you get the minerals out is first of all, a lot of these are undeveloped sites. So you have to develop the sites, right? It requires a lot of technology to go in. It requires a lot of engineers to oversee it. It requires geologists to look at it. It's not like old-fashioned miners digging away to get a few diamonds to get a bit of gold, right? But Trump doesn't comprehend that, which is why he comes up with this idea of, oh, that's the security guarantee. And that's just absolute nonsense. But when Macron went over there, when Starmer went over there, when Zelensky's over there, they're not just talking to Trump, they're talking to American officials behind the scenes, behind closed doors. And I will say this to you, as someone who's very skeptical that the Trump administration in the end will support Ukraine. I don't think they will. But I have to say that if we take it back to the minerals deal, the first version of that minerals deal that the Americans presented was just an ultimatum. It was like a mafia boss going in and saying, give us this and we'll protect you. It's protection money, extortion. The revised version of that deal is actually that it's a 50-50 joint ownership, that the money is not just simply sent back to the United States to repay past debts, but part of the money is put back into Ukraine's reconstruction. Now, someone on the U.S. side will have to have negotiated that far more sensible deal. So there are still adults in the room in the American administration. They just don't get the headlines. And the question here is, are there adults in the Trump administration who will seriously discuss security guarantees with Europe and with Ukraine? That is an open question, which I can't answer at this point.
Do you think, though,
we may get a clue.
Will Ukraine get its security? Okay, so Ukraine wants security guarantees. Putin wants his own security guarantee, both for separate reasons. Putin doesn't want NATO in the backyard. I said they don't want EU either in their backyard. And Ukraine is saying, look, I need guarantees to make sure that I don't get invaded again. That's really where everything is going to, that's where the issue is.
Yeah, but here's the nub that we got to walk it back to. There has always been the offer on the table to security guarantees Ukraine and Russia. That's always been on the table.
And what were those? What were those?
Okay, so if you walk this back to first of all, Ukraine 2017, what about Russian security? That was what I was saying. Is the question, what would happen to those two areas of Ukraine? So Russia, for example, had seized Crimea. You have eastern Ukraine, where Russia is supporting separatists. Those were the issues of the so-called Minsk agreements. Right? And we talked about all that. Nothing in that discussion where Russia was threatened. We were never talking about a threat to Russia's territory, Russia's sovereignty. In 2021, at the end of 2021, the Kremlin's play is, we want security guarantees, right? You might remember this. But they also said, we want security guaranteed military and neutral Ukraine. So Ukraine's military would be limited. Its political options would be limited. We want autonomy. Eastern Ukraine doesn't accept that. So in other words, there's never been a question that Russia has not been able to get a security guarantee. It's always the state. Ukraine now with Vladimir Zelensky, to get it in which Ukraine forces would withdraw from Kursk in exchange for forces withdrawing from eastern Ukraine.
But it's the territory. Is Russia's got what? 3 or 4 territories from Russia gives it quite huge.
Yeah, then you got a fundamental question. First of all, question, if you think about this in Africa, if Nigeria, pick one of your neighbors.
Ghana.
One of your neighbors said, okay, pick Ghana. Don't want to pick on Ghana, but pick Ghana. And if Ghana came out tomorrow and they said, oh, look at those Nigerians. They're cozying up to the Americans, or they're cozying up to the Europeans, those Nigerians, and look at their leadership. We don't like their leadership, right? And if Ghana said, we want a security guarantee where they send troops across your border and take 25% of your country and say, okay, now we're going to negotiate to keep that 25% of Nigeria we take it. That's the position we're in with you. Russia, yes. Is that Russia? Okay, that's not a negotiation. That's an ultimatum. I mean, that's what it fundamentally is.
Well, this is all ceasefire deal. It's really up in the air because somebody's got to move for somebody, and both are quite clearly not wanting to move. You've got Russia standing by itself. Well, if you like, you've got Trump behind them, and then you've got Zelensky. You've got Ukraine's got all of Europe and NATO behind it. It's going to go on forever. Let's move because this is so superbly interesting.
Well, I give 30 seconds. I'll tell you the deal that's on the table if Trump had not been elected.
Oh, tell us.
The deal is on the table, and it's there if you read the public statements for several months, is a parallel to West Germany and East Germany in the Cold War. Okay. And that is because, of course, East Germany was part of the Soviet sphere for 40 years. And Russia could continue to occupy the areas that it holds right now for the short term. But in return, Ukraine would get those security guarantees, not necessarily membership of NATO, but at least guarantees that it would get military assistance and it would get support if Russia attacked again. That is almost exactly the position we were in 1949 after the Berlin blockade. East Germany stayed within the Soviet sphere of influence. West Germany became part of NATO. And of course, West Germany developed much more rapidly economically than East Germany did. That's the play that Ukraine would have gone for. But Trump being elected threw everything up in the air.
Okay. Now, we had the G20 recently. Everybody was there apart from a representation of the United States because it was in South Africa. However, the United States is supposed to take over from South Africa. Right? No. So what's going on? We know Trump is upset for something that is completely not his business, which is a fallacy. Fallacy keeps going on about, with regards to the land reforms. But what's going to happen with the G20? How is there going to be a handover if they're not talking?
Yeah, nobody that I know of in the UK or France or Western Europe or the US has been paying attention to it, which of course you all are because you're right there close to what happened in South Africa. Absolutely. I mean, I personally think that Donald Trump will agree to anything where he can have a photo opportunity. And of course, the G20 would be on his turf, right?
Right.
So I don't think it's that the G20 won't be held. I think it's the question of what kind of show will Trump put on, right? So first of all, Russia's going to be there. And whether the U.S. and Russia put on this show that they're all good buddies there, right? The Gulf states will be there, right? And they'll have their own play, their own power play. But it's then when you talk about South Africa being there, it's like, okay, will he snub South Africa? I think he'll try to humiliate South Africa because that's what he tends to do, right? If I don't like you. To take it back to what Keir Starmer did. Keir Starmer made sure he wasn't humiliated yesterday by giving the shiny thing to Trump. Here's your shiny thing. What shiny thing could South Africa give Trump in the next few months? With respect, South Africa's got lots of great things, but there's nothing that Trump's really interested in.
Absolutely.
Unless all of a sudden, I don't know if there's a Trump Tower in Joburg, but whether or not there's like a Trump Tower, they suddenly agree to in Joburg. It's like, okay, this is what you get.
Yeah.
And by the way, I'm not joking. I'm not joking that if they said you could have a Trump Tower in Joburg, that's fine, because there is an appalling video. Because another thing we've been talking about is Gaza. There's an appalling video today out this week. It shows what Gaza would look like. And the other pieces of this are, besides bearded belly dancers and besides topless Benjamin Netanyahu and Donald Trump drinking on the beach, which I'll never unsee, is a giant golden statue of Donald Trump and Trump Tower, right?
Yeah.
So, that I think at this point, I'm not there. I'm not here to advise South Africa.
Yeah.
They have their own things, but I think very much right now, South Africa should not get distracted by the fact that G20 is in the States. They simply keep their eyes on the lines that they're pursuing legally and politically and economically, right? Because there's a key element here. Besides South Africa and the U.S., there are 8 members of the G20. You need to simply care to Trump.
Should I tell you something curious about that video? And I had to remind people yesterday when it was all over international, the global. That video was in Nigeria 2 weeks or a week ago. I'm wondering if it was done by a Nigerian. Because it was. Yes, it was on my WhatsApp. So I was thinking,
holy smokes.
Why is everybody just... Trump just found, so when people were posting them with that, Trump posted this, immediately I was like, well, this is a spoof. I saw it a week or 2 weeks ago, literally.
Okay.
So I'm actually wondering if it was done by a Nigerian, because why did we get it first? And the world didn't know that, because even I did. If I had posted on my Instagram, perhaps I would have had the proof. It was on WhatsApp group. That I had it, and I'll look for it actually, and I'll screen munch it and send it to you. It was weird, very, very weird. Yeah. This is the thing. Let's talk about Israel and Gaza. So Israel is clearly not sticking to their side of the ceasefire deal.
Yeah,
what they're doing. The war that they're raging in the West Bank. Outside of that, what do you think Israel is really up to, especially with regards to this ceasefire?
It depends on which part of Israel you talk to. But if you talk to, I think, the right wing in the Israeli government and Benjamin Netanyahu, I think when it comes to Gaza, they're looking for freedom of action. And by that, I mean the ceasefire ends tomorrow. Phase 1 ends tomorrow, and there is no phase 2, right?
They haven't started discussing.
They briefly talked about the fact they were gathering in Doha and in Egypt, and then nothing came of that. That was like, what? Like, here, they're gone. And again, a reminder, right, you don't get phase 2 unless you get an agreement on Israeli withdrawal from Gaza, and you get an agreement on a Palestinian government. You don't get a phase 2. You don't get the hostages back. You don't get the detainees back from the Israeli prisons. Now, for the hard right in Israeli politics, I don't think that matters, because they want freedom of action. And freedom of action means, it doesn't necessarily mean that as soon as phase 1 ends tomorrow, that Israel goes all out with the bombing and the airstrikes, but they can do so if they want to, right? And so it's like that sort of Damocles that you hold over Gazans, which is, we can hit you again, right? And when they'll hit will turn not only upon what happens in Gaza, it turns upon what will happen in Israel, because they're going to face a lot of Israelis who are going to be upset that there isn't a phase 2.
Yeah.
Especially the families of the hostages. Between 50 and 60 are still dead or alive who are still held by Hamas. and other groups in Gaza. So we've got this state of deadly limbo, which comes in from tomorrow. But then I'm pleased that you looked at the West Bank, because the fact here is that Israel has been expanding its military operations in the West Bank. And that's not just simply, quote, a security issue. There's the question about whether Israel expands the settlements and whether they expand their claims on territory up in the West Bank. There is no meaningful negotiation to return the West Bank to Palestine. There hasn't been for years. Everybody is focused on Gaza right now, understandably. So the Israelis use that freedom of action to put more pressure on areas like Jenin. Now, you could say it's simply just to tighten up the occupation, but it could say it's also to soften up the West Bank, where they effectively continue, because it's not a question of annexing the territory. In effect, they have already annexed part of the territory and just aren't giving it back. And they may reinforce that position. And the reason why I think that will happen is because there are a lot of people in the Trump administration who are supporters of that expansion in the West Bank. The current U.S. ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, is. And I believe the current Trump's Middle East envoy, Steve Witkoff, who's he's a real estate developer, but his public sentiments have been, Israel has a right to the West Bank. So I think we're going to face Israel effectively exploiting freedom of action and then hoping that domestically they don't come under too much pressure, especially over the questions of the hostages, so that freedom of action is limited.
Here's the thing. So Hamas has been saying, we're sticking to our side of the deal. We're releasing hostages. We're doing everything we're supposed to do. We are ready for phase 2. Hamas has also said, we are ready to release all Israeli hostages in our captivity, as long as Israel gets out of Gaza, vacates from Gaza, and allows the Palestinian to begin to rebuild, etc. Right? That's a demand, albeit a subtle one, if you like, the way they're saying it. But that's a demand that Israel hasn't responded to. Now, the last time you were on the show, you said, it's not going to be Hamas. Everybody keeps saying it's not going to be Hamas. Hamas has said it doesn't have to be us. But my question to everybody, they've said we don't have to be there. We don't mind being in the background. But Dr. Basim Naim was on this show, and it was also on Al Jazeera. And he said, all the Palestinians want is their freedom. The freedom, to rule themselves, for self-rule, etc., etc. If not Hamas, then who? Because Israel also doesn't want the Palestinian Authority, right? Israel has refused to release Marwan Barghouti, who I'm sure you know who he is. So,
absolutely,
what's the way forward?
Okay, well, let's take the levels of questions. First of all, in terms of where we are, rather way forward, the reason why that Hamas offer is not going to be accepted, at least not immediately, is because the demands of the Netanyahu government, at least Netanyahu and the right wing in that government, is not just that Hamas does not come back into government. It's that Hamas leaders leave Gaza, right?
Yeah.
They don't want Hamas in Gaza. Now, there's no way Hamas are going to agree to that. Hamas are going to, I'm not a big fan of Hamas. I can explain why if you want to. But
I will ask you why, actually. It's on my list of questions for you. You said that last week.
You know that the play that Hamas is going to make, as any party would be, is we stand here with our civilians. We stand here with the civilians, right? We're not going to leave them. We're not going to abandon them. So they're already there. You've got a stalemate that takes place. You have the wider question, which is, all right, if not Hamas, then whom? And, the answer is, well, you look for a coalition of Palestinians, right, that provide the government. The problem with the Palestinian Authority is it doesn't carry a lot of support amongst Palestinians. It's not that well liked in the West Bank. It's suspended elections for many years so that Abbas can stay in power. He's well into his 80s. They are, I'm going to use a phrase, you'll know what the meaning of it is. They're economically challenged in the way that they use their money, right? And that has been the case for years. They're not seen as representative of the people in terms of what they've done. And of course, they have effectively been in what has been at times a very hot war and at other times a low-intensity war with Hamas since 2007, since Hamas kicked Fatah, which is effectively the party of the Palestinian Authority, out of Gaza. So all of that's in play. So PA not there. All right, well, okay. Is there another Palestinian group that you could get together? And some people have said, well, you get the civil society group together and the technocrats together. You've just mentioned the fact that some of those people, like Marwan Barghouti, are in prison, and the Israelis don't show signs of releasing them. You have other questions in terms of in an area which has been cut off and destroyed like Gaza, how can you assemble these technocrats to run the area, right? And you have the other point here is that technocrats need political support. Even if the politicians aren't in the government, there needs to be political support behind them. So you've got to assemble all of that. I'm not even going to talk about Arab states coming in and keeping the peace, because the Arab states have no interest in putting their own troops in there. That's not going to happen. So what Hamas's play is here, I would suspect, is that Hamas can say, oh, it doesn't have to be us. It can be someone else, because right now there is no someone else. Yeah. And so Hamas bides its time, and then people almost by default go back and say, well, it's got to be Hamas because there's no one else.
Right, I get you.
That's there.
Yeah. I get you. Okay, you can call. I know one of you has been trying to call 0201 277 0993, 0201 465 7190. You can send a WhatsApp message to 0809 597 5805. Now I have to ask you, you said you don't like Hamas. Why don't you like Hamas? But before I even, actually, go ahead. Tell us why you don't like Hamas. They're already calling. So you have to be quick.
Yeah, the wider picture is that Hamas, since it consolidated power in 2007, I think it has actually cut down on the space of Palestinian civil society. They've been very harsh on not just dissidents, they've been harsh on journalists. They've been harsh on other activists. I do think they are, I used this phrase a minute ago, I think at times they have been economically challenged. They have actually, in a sense, been the other side of the Israeli blockade, in that they've been able to profit from the Israeli blockade at times. I think their leadership has been divided in some that have said, look, we want the 1967 borders, right? But there are others who have said, no, we don't want any borders. In other words, a perpetual war with Israel. But the reason to give Hamas is that while we could talk about how this violence in which civilians pay the price goes all the way back to the formation of the State of Israel and before, on October 7th, 2023, Hamas broke the rules of the game. You may not like the rules, but going in and killing almost 1,200 people, several hundred of whom were just simply civilians, and doing that with a ground incursion, Israel was bound to respond to that. And I effectively think that with that attack, Israel killed almost 50,000 Gazans. But in a way, Hamas sacrificed a lot of those Gazans when it went into Israel to kill those Israelis.
So at this point, as an Irishman, I have to ask you then, how did you feel about the IRA, Northern Ireland? I remember Bloody Sunday. I remember the bombing of the Brighton Hotel, right? Because I'm a child of the UK, as you know. Yeah. So how was that? Because when a lot of people it's a parallel juxtaposition, if you like, this fight for freedom, albeit with violence, etc., which the IRA did.
I mean, I would love to talk to you about this, and I'm trying to wedge myself back into another program because there's so much I can tell you.
Yeah, you have to be very quick as well because the lines are going.
Very good. Remember that I was in the UK from 1984. So, in fact, I was seeing Ireland from a UK perspective. Yeah. Not that I agree with the UK's perspective. I've only lived in Ireland in the past 12 months, although I've worked here on and off for 20 years. What I would say to you in a nutshell to start off with this is that the IRA, in a sense, and I say this because of a lot of my friends in the North and here, in a way, what the British did was horrible. It was absolutely horrible what they did for decades. But the IRA in its own way also held civilians hostage. It was not only because they went and killed Protestants and attacked them. They would carry out attacks knowing that the retribution would be on civilians, right? And there are a lot of people today, both in the South and in the North, who do not like Sinn Féin because of this. Yeah. What I'll say to you, though, with respect for relevance for Nigeria as well as Gaza, what did not happen is that there was always a center ground of civil society and activists that remained in Northern Ireland.
Right.
The parties are the SDLP, the alliance parties, but there were also NGOs. There were religious people, there were lawyers, there were students, there were journalists. Those people helped make the Good Friday Agreement in 1998. IRA signed on to it, but it took those people to show the way forward.
Thank you. Hello? Hello? Hello?
Hello.
Yes.
Hello. Good evening, Sister Oge. Good evening to your guest.
Good evening.
Yeah, this is the merchant man.
Yeah.
My question to your guest is on Zelensky and his deal with the U.S.
Yeah.
So my question is his post-deal security condition, because I know that most of his countrymen are not happy with him to sign off the rare earth minerals to the U.S. So now he's negotiating between either going to Turkey or to Iran for safety if he eventually surrenders part of those minerals to the U.S. So my question is, what is likely the guarantee of his security? Because if he stays in Ukraine, he might be assassinated.
Yeah.
Then if he says, because the most confused president in the whole world now is Zelensky. If he doesn't put a pen to the deal, he's in trouble.
Yeah.
If he does, he's in trouble. So
he's damned if you do, if you damned if you don't. Yeah.
Yeah. So what is his fate if he eventually puts the pen to the deal after the signing? That's my question. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Scott, hold on a second. Great question. Yeah, hold on. Hello.
Hello, Sister again.
Yes, very quickly, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's Lopa here.
Yes, go ahead.
I want to ask the Professor, is that because Zelensky is a neighbor to Russia and Russia should not stop them from being NATO members, whatever? I want to ask, what happened in the 60s when the then Soviet Union attempted to have a military base in Cuba? America rejected, and that's failed. Russia is a superpower. Superpower does whatever they do.
What's your question, Titilope?
What is the difference between the interest of Soviet Union, the then Soviet Union, to have the military base beside America in Cuba?
Right.
America rejected that.
Yes, they did.
It happened in Falkland Island, UK versus Argentina.
Yeah.
As we look at the proximity, that's why the proximity, UK won that land.
Yeah.
So Russia is a superpower. Why should the case of Russia be an aberration? That's one. Number two.
Quickly.
Sorry, ma. The New Deal now. There's America on the one side, there's Zelensky and Europe on the other side, and there's Russia on the other side. That makes it a tripartite relationship. Now, there's a first agreement between Trump and the Europeans now going on. Whatever they agreed upon now, is it going to be tabled before Putin? That is by Trump. Do you think Vladimir Putin is going to do anything that is going to put it at disadvantage, given all?
Okay, you've used up all the time left, Dr. Lokwe.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, there you go. I'm going to give you 3 minutes for those two questions.
Okay. You'll have to summarize question 2 for me. And while you're thinking about that, I'll deal with question 1. Great question. First of all, I think we have a couple of basic facts that are important here.
Yeah.
In terms of overall support for Zelensky, because Donald Trump lied about this last week, said he only had 4% support. Vladimir Zelensky has support of about 58% of Ukrainians. That's the latest poll that's come out. About 63% of Ukrainians support the way that the war is being conducted, or the resistance is being conducted. So there still is support very much for Zelensky. Now, I've got friends in Kyiv. I've got students in Kyiv. And I asked them what they thought about the raw minerals deal. They honestly said, we don't like the deal. We feel betrayed by it. But I think there are 2 things that may shift their opinion. Because 2 of these people were in my class coming in from Kyiv, and we talked it through. The first is the initial U.S. version of this deal was not good at all for Ukraine. It was an ultimatum. It was a ripoff. We've discussed that. The revised version of the deal is far different, but I'm not sure that got out into the press. Secondly, I think the key here is that Zelensky saying, look, this isn't the deal in and of itself. This doesn't end it. We're using this deal to also get security guarantees. If Zelensky can do that, then I think he gets overwhelming support for Ukrainians, for getting the U.S. behind them, right? That's going to be the challenge for him. Now, The second question, I heard Cuba in there. I heard
so the second one was to do with, look, there was a time when the Soviet Union wanted to build a base in Cuba, and Kennedy said, hell no, over my dead body. Russia is pushing back on the same thing, and Russia is being treated like the devil. Why?
Well, I'm going to say this in a way which you and I have talked about when we talk about, we look at leaders or we talk about America and Russia and China and so on. My starting point here is the Ukrainian people. Okay. Now we can talk about Cuba and the Cuban people at some point. We can talk about Ireland and the Irish people at some point. The fundamental here is that people who had their own country, who had their own way of life since 2014, they've actually had a neighbor, Russia, that's been trying to split that country apart, that has seized territory like Crimea. Remember, that was 2014.
Yeah.
That have sent in special forces in the east of the country, that sent weapons in to insurgents, that shot down a Malaysian airliner with almost 300 people on board, right? Since 2022.
Was that confirmed though, Scott?
Yeah, it's confirmed.
Okay.
Dutch courts have confirmed it legally.
Okay.
2022, they send in the second largest army in the world to overrun this country. They try to capture or kill the country's leaders. They kill a lot of civilians in the first week of the war in mass killings at places like Busha and Erpin, just outside. They continue, even though they're not successful at overrunning the country, to kill civilians on a daily basis. They have deported hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians. They have deported at least 20,000 children. They have carried out executions and war crimes against Ukrainian POWs. The large proportion of war crimes in this case, more than 90%, have been by Russia. Why do I think that Vladimir Putin should carry responsibility and be criticized for this? It's not because I'm anti-Russian. It's not because I favor war. It's because I think the first rule is you protect civilians. You talk about what civilians need. And this war, this killing of civilians could be stopped now, first and foremost by Vladimir Putin. The reason why he chooses not to do so, let me turn it over to him. On Wednesday, he told a meeting of officials that it was essential that Russia had to get those 4 territories, those 4 regions, which he says he annexed, some of which that territory is still controlled by Ukraine. They control parts of those regions. And then he said, effectively, there has to be a change of government in Ukraine. There has to be a different government. That's not his decision to make.
Okay.
That's Ukrainians who had decided that.
Right. Before you go, let's talk USAID, because that's the other one that I wanted to cover last week that we didn't get around to. So I can sneak that in. We've got 3.5 minutes. USAID, the dismantling of USAID, personally, like I said, I think it's a good thing for Africa. It allows us to be free. What do you think? And really, was it really a vehicle for not just the Democrats? Because you have to explain to people, America hasn't just been the Democrats. It's been the Democrats. It's been the Republicans. Has it just been that vehicle where, successive American governments can actually use it, to invade, to control, to change, etc., other people's countries?
Yeah, USAID was created by President Kennedy in the early 60s, and it was not created as part of regime change. What it was created was part of American soft power, which is we project America not as a military force, but we project it as a humanitarian force, right? And you can question that, but there's that soft power goal. Okay, here we are 64 years later, and USAID is still a vehicle for soft power, right? In the way we talk about how the Chinese put out people to build things, and that's soft power, right? And the British Council have soft power. My question here is what does the USAID do, right? And I'm going to give you a couple of things that have. First of all, 90% of the USAID budget is now been cut. Yeah. 90% is out. That is around about $39 billion gone. One thing that has come out today, and this comes not from the US government, this comes from experts, from doctors, from other personnel who work with this. It is estimated that 500,000 people, because of these cuts, are at risk or indeed could well die of HIV and AIDS this year. 500,000. That's the number that they've put out, right? That's because those drugs that AID supports, the retro antivirals, you don't get them now. That money is not there to provide it. There are certain diseases that were being worked on in Africa, in other areas of the world for eradication. That effort is put back. There's certain movements for civil societies not to be dominated by the US, but to encourage people to take control of their communities. That's gone. I absolutely agree with you that African communities need to step up to represent African communities. But I also believe that this is a cooperative project. As much as we hear about Americans who try to dominate other places, there were actually other Americans, even though they knows they makes them look good, who actually do want to work with others. You know, I can think of the Peace Corps. We can talk about that. And my point is, I like to accept help from anybody. I like it if they are British or Nigerian or Chinese, maybe not the Russians right now, but that's a bit checkered, right? But I like help from me because I believe in a cooperative approach. And I think USAID, for all the faults of U.S. foreign policy, offered you that opportunity. Now people will die because of that it's no longer there.
Professor Scott Lucas, you've got to come back. You've got to come back. I know we won't bother you to come back next week, but you'll come back again. Thank you so much. An absolute pleasure as usual.
And to all your great listeners out there, you all keep doing great things. Be kind to each other. And I look forward to seeing you soon.
You have a fabulous weekend. Thank you. Take care.
You.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye.
Talk that matters to you.
When you marry, you don't cheat.
The most common drug that damages the liver is paracetamol, what we call acetaminophen. People think that paracetamol is just paracetamol. I can take paracetamol. No.
Do you know I've been monitoring elections since 1999? Rigging of elections takes place not at the polling unit, but at the collation center.
99.3 Nigeria Info. Let's talk. 99.3 Nigeria Info. We are more than just radio. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at Nigeria Info FM. Check us out on Facebook at Nigeria Info 99.3. Follow us on Twitter at Nigeria Info FM and on Instagram at Nigeria Info FM Lagos for live updates as it happens. 99.3 Nigeria Info. Let's talk.